English 2322 audio lecture. Historical background for Shakespeare's 1 Henry IV. I know some of you have not exactly been looking forward to the part of the class where we get to read Shakespeare. Shakespeare has, well, I guess kind of a conflicted reputation among students. They understand that he's supposedly the greatest author in English history, possibly the greatest author in Western history altogether, but they also know that he's really, really hard to read. In fact, even though the language of Chaucer is harder to read, I think a lot of students would rather read Chaucer than read Shakespeare. Maybe because with the Shakespeare, there's this assumption that you'll be able to read it. In other words, teachers have been giving you Shakespeare in his original language for several years, probably. Most of you probably read that in high school. I started reading Shakespeare in school in junior high. And there's no question that Shakespeare can be difficult. There are some aids that can help you. First of all, I've put a link on the course page to to a version of the play called the No Fear Shakespeare series, which has the play sort of facing page translation, both in the original Shakespearean English and then in a sort of modernized, almost summarized version. So if you need that, by all means use it. Also pay attention to things like the footnotes at the bottom of the page in the version of the play that you're reading, and even the introduction to the play. I think it can be useful. Shakespeare is hard. I will say that different plays that he wrote are hard for different reasons. All of his plays are difficult because of the language, because of the diction. In other words, the sort of order of words in the sentence can make it hard for us to read. Even though we know all the individual words, sometimes it's still hard to make sense of. I would point out, before I go any further, that Shakespeare wasn't being intentionally difficult. By all accounts, his plays were perfectly understandable even to uneducated people in his contemporary England. The problem is that we're not living in 16th century England or early 17th century England, and as a result, the language feels very, very foreign to us. But sometimes there's more difficulty than just the language. And I think anytime you read one of Shakespeare's history plays, there are additional challenges that present themselves. Maybe a little note here is in order. Shakespeare's plays have traditionally been divided into tragedies. These are plays like Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, some of Shakespeare's most famous plays. Comedies, plays like As You Like It or The Taming of the Shrew or The Two Gentlemen of Verona. These are plays that are less commonly read, but are still sometimes performed. And then history plays. His history plays generally deal with English history, especially the history of the 15th century in England, the time from about 1400 to about 1500. And I'm guessing these are plays that you're less familiar with. Shakespeare's history plays are not very commonly performed anymore. There haven't been a lot of Hollywood adaptations of these plays. There are a couple. Kenneth Branagh did a film of Henry V about 10 years ago or so, and around the same time there was an interesting adaptation of Richard III. But most of these plays, while they were apparently very popular during Shakespeare's own time period, have sort of fallen out of popularity with contemporary audiences. And I think one of the reasons why these plays, among them, by the way, is 1 Henry IV, the play you're reading right now, sometimes called Henry the first part of Henry IV or Henry IV Part 1, but often Shakespeare scholars just refer to it as 1 Henry IV as opposed to 2 Henry IV, which is the sequel to it. 1 Henry IV is a history play, and like the other history plays, it's not terribly popular with modern audiences, partially, I think, because there's a lot of sort of outside knowledge that you need in order to really understand this play. I said earlier that Shakespeare's language wouldn't be that difficult for us if we were living in his time period in Elizabethan England. And that's especially true of reading plays like the history plays, because Shakespeare makes a lot of assumptions about what his audience knows about the historical figures in the play, knows about their background, knows about important sort of political events, important battles, etc. So he doesn't explain a lot in a play like 1 Henry IV, probably because his audience would have been as familiar with those events as we might be with the Revolutionary War, for example. But of course, we're not familiar with the events of 15th century English history. And as a result, a play like 1 Henry IV, from the very beginning, we're pretty well confused because we don't know what these characters are referring to. We don't know when they're living, what the relationships are between them. And while he makes some of that clear during the play itself, there's a lot that he, again, sort of expects the audience to know. So I thought I'd record a brief lecture, or as brief as it can be, giving you a little bit of the necessary background to this play so that you understand sort of what was going on with these characters in history that may have led Shakespeare to write this play about these particular events. This play, like a lot of Shakespeare's history plays, takes place in the 15th century, in other words, in the 1400s. This was a very volatile period in English history, English political history anyway, and that may be one reason why Shakespeare was so interested in the time period. He wrote essentially, there's 4 plays, what's known as the first tetralogy, which includes Richard II, 1 Henry IV, 2 Henry IV, and Henry V, about this period. And then he also wrote another group of 4 plays. There's 3 Henry VI plays, part 1, 2, and 3, and then Richard III. All of these plays take place in the 15th century. And the reason that the 15th century was such a volatile period is because of problems with the idea of royal succession. In other words, questions about who was going to become king. And to understand where these problems came from, we actually have to go back a little bit and look at some events in the later 14th century. Now, the King of England for the majority of the 14th century was a guy known as Edward III. And Edward III, Edward III was the king for most of Chaucer's lifetime, for example. So that gives you an idea of when we're talking about. He was apparently a very effective king, apparently a very popular king. He ruled for 50 years, which is a very long time to be king of England. In fact, one of the longest-serving English monarchs in all of English history. But when Edward died in 1377, there was uncertainty regarding who was going to take over the throne from him. Now, the reason for this uncertainty has to do with Edward's heirs. Edward had 3 sons, which is usually great for an English king, because that means if you've got plenty of heirs. But because Edward lived so long, his eldest son, also known as Edward, this is sometimes known as Edward the Black Prince, had actually already died before Edward III, the king, died. Edward also had 2 younger sons. Their names were Lionel, usually known as Lionel of Antwerp, and John, usually known as John of Gaunt. He's also known as the Duke of Lancaster, and that's going to be kind of important later. Because the Black Prince, Edward, had already died when Edward III, the king, died, this is going to seem kind of strange to you. That the normal assumption from our side might be that then Lionel would become king, but that's actually not the way it worked in the English system. Everything had to go through the eldest son, and when Edward the Black Prince died, he already had a son as well. His son's name was Richard. And so when Edward III died, rather than the throne going to his son, his eldest son, or one of his younger 2 sons, the throne actually went to his grandson, Richard II. Now, unfortunately, when Richard II became king, he was only 10 years old, which is, a little young to be managing an entire kingdom. Also, unfortunately, his 2 elder uncles, Lionel and John of Gaunt, were still alive. And you can kind of imagine the sort of awkwardness here. This 10-year-old boy has become king when these 2 older princes who had been alive for a good part of their father's reign were passed over. So there may have been some hard feelings sort of from the beginning. But the real problem is that Richard, in addition to being young among some very experienced and possibly bitter rivals, was also apparently not a very good king even when he got older. He was described as being petty and vindictive, for example. So in 1399, when John of Gaunt, this would be his uncle, remember, Edward III's youngest son, and John of Gaunt, by the way, had been a very powerful man in England throughout the 14th century, and especially when Richard was young, John of Gaunt was probably the most powerful man in England, more powerful than Richard himself. But when John of Gaunt died, Richard had all of John's lands confiscated rather than allowing that property to go to John's heir, who was named Henry and often called Henry Bolingbroke because he had been born at Bolingbroke Castle. Now, as you hopefully have already figured out, Henry Bolingbroke is the man who eventually becomes Henry IV, and it's this event, Richard II seizing the lands that belonged to Henry's father, John of Gaunt, that precipitated Henry's attempt to depose Richard, which he succeeded in doing just a few months after John of Gaunt had died. So Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, is the king in the play that we're reading. Now, don't get confused, because the main character of this play appears to be Henry IV's son, who's also named Henry, unfortunately. It makes it a little harder to follow. But luckily, Shakespeare refers to him as Prince Hal throughout the play. And Hal, who, well, we'll talk about what Hal is like in later lectures, but Hal is the prince throughout this play and the succeeding play to Henry IV, the second part of Henry IV. He eventually will become king and will become Henry V, and he has his own play named after him. But don't sometimes students get confused because the play seems to be about Hal, and they think maybe he is Henry IV, but he's actually Henry V. His father, Henry IV, is king in this play. Now, some of the other characters in the play are also involved in some of the events I've been talking about. So Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, was a very powerful landowner in the northern part of England who helped Henry Bolingbroke in his revolt against Richard II. So at the beginning of the play, there's a little bit of strife between the Percys and the king, Henry IV, and part of that seems to be that, at least in Shakespeare's account, they didn't feel that Henry IV was grateful enough for the help that they had given him. And some of the main action in this play is going to involve a revolt by the Percys against the king. And I think rather than looking at the reasons for the revolt, and Shakespeare will present some reasons that may or may not be historically accurate, I think what's important here is the understanding that it was Henry's own claim to the throne that led the Percys to think that they could possibly challenge him. In other words, once Henry had challenged the right of Richard II to be king, that kind of opened the door for other people to challenge his right to be king. In other words, once succession is an issue, it tends to remain an issue. And in fact, it was an issue throughout the 15th century. There were people who thought that Henry's claims to the throne were invalid. Later, several generations down, a lot of sort of family strife back and forth between two branches of the English royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. This is the period generally known as the Wars of the Roses, and that's the later part of the 15th century. But all of these problems in England in the 15th century had to do with this one central question. What do you do when the king doesn't have a clear heir? In Shakespeare's play, there's another character, Edmund Mortimer. It's not usually known as just Mortimer, sometimes referred to as the Earl of March. And Mortimer, at the beginning of the play, has been captured in battle by a Welsh warrior and leader, a really interesting character named Owen Glendower. And Mortimer has been captured, and Percy's son, Harry Percy, who's usually known as Hotspur in the play, and I think part of this may just be to try to keep the characters straight. So rather than referring to Henry IV's son, Henry, we refer to him as Hal. And rather than referring to Henry Percy's son, Henry or Harry, we refer to him as Hotspur. Well, Hotspur is asking the king to ransom Edmund Mortimer. And the reason he is that Hotspur is married to Mortimer's sister. So there's a family connection there. But Mortimer is actually much more important for other reasons, because Mortimer was the grandson of Lionel of Antwerp, who you may remember was Edward III's second son. In other words, Mortimer has a claim to the throne himself, and according to some English observers, maybe a stronger claim than Henry of Bolingbroke does, because Henry is the son of Edward III's youngest son, John of Gaunt, while Mortimer is the grandson of Edward III's middle son, Lionel of Antwerp. So there's all these questions: who should be king? And I think that Shakespeare really is interested in this question, but not in the political sense. He is not particularly interested in getting into a discussion of how succession should work. And probably the reason he's not is that succession, you may know, was an issue during Shakespeare's own time as well. Henry VIII had been king early in the 16th century, and when he died, he did have one male heir, but that heir died very young, and as a result, there were questions: could a female take over as ruler of England? And of course, that is what happened when Henry's eldest daughter Mary became queen, and then later his second daughter Elizabeth became queen, and that's the ruler during Shakespeare's own lifetime. So I think Shakespeare really wants to stay out of questions of how succession should work. But he is interested in the larger question of who should be king. But for Shakespeare, it's more of a question of what kind of person should be king, or what should the king be like. And Shakespeare, in a lot of his plays, presents different images of kingship. And in a later lecture, we'll talk about some of Shakespeare's ideas about kingship, because I think that this is one of the most interesting of all his plays in that regard. But I hope that some of this historical information will make at least the beginning of the play easier for you, help you understand why Henry is having these conversations with the Percys, who Northumberland is, or Westmoreland. Westmoreland, by the way, is Henry Percy's brother. And just what's going on, what's the political context of some of these early scenes. I don't think that'll make the language any easier for you. I have posted on the course page that link I mentioned earlier to the No Fear Shakespeare version of the play, which I think will make it easier for you. But hopefully understanding a little bit about the history will help you understand sort of where Shakespeare is coming from at the beginning of this play. If you have any questions about any of this material or about the play itself, please don't hesitate to ask me. Thank you.